Great. Welcome, everyone. Glad that you're here today for this exciting environmental health seminar series. And as people come in, I just want to remind you to please sign in. There's sign-in sheets in the back and then in the little hallway when you walk in. I'm Ellen Hahn. I direct the UK CARE Center for Appalachian Research. Center for Appalachian Research and Environmental Sciences, and we're very happy to have Nick Newman with us today. He's a colleague of ours at the University of Cincinnati. He's a board-certified physician in general pediatrics as well as occupational environmental medicine. He has worked for many years on the Community Engagement Core at the University of Cincinnati Center for Environmental Genetics, and it is another P30 center like ours just up the road. So we've been wanting to have Nick come for a long time. He's going to talk to you a little bit about pediatric environmental health. It's something that we want to see grow here at the University of Kentucky. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at University of Cincinnati. He works not only on the lead issue, I think that's for many years, but more recently he's been working on air pollution and how it impacts children's health. So we're really happy that you're here. And there will be, I think, Kara, Zoom, right? There are people also on Zoom. Okay, great.
I'll step out and make sure.
Okay, perfect.
Zoom check. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. I like to move around a little bit, but from what I understand, like I have to stay with the mic and the camera and all the other stuff. So, I call this, pediatric environmental health. Why should we care? More, it's kind of like a little introduction, and I guess I care a lot about it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you should. But I think maybe by the time you're done, you'll see why this is an important area. And if I can, oh, there we go. So this is the standard disclaimer I have to put out. Basically, I get some government funding, but I'm not a spokesperson for the government, particularly not the EPA. I don't have any financial relationships that are relevant to what I'm talking about, although I've just started a clinical trial from a corporate doing some a clinical trial that is unrelated to science. So just as a little bit of an outline, I want to introduce some of the basic concepts of environmental health in children, and then explore some of the research that's going on about two neurodevelopmental toxicants, one being lead and the other traffic-related air pollution. And I think the lead is well known. I think the traffic is less well known. And so I'll just be sharing some of the work that I've done and not do a complete like soup to nuts about either of those, because that wouldn't be an entire course, really. And then discuss the pediatric environmental health specialty units, which I'm part of, and that is where you can get particularly clinicians or others. I've helped investigators on studies also dealing with biomarker results or other things that were unexpected related to children's environmental health. So does anyone, I took art history in college just for fun, and so I love putting things up. Is this familiar to anyone at all? Yes. So, right, exactly. So I think the specific one is like Saturn eating his children, but that was another name for the same Roman god. So the reason I bring this up, this is Goya, and the prophecy was that Saturn, who is head of all of some of the gods, was going to be overthrown by one of his offspring, and so every time his wife had a child, he would eat it. But anyway, so the story goes, and of course, like the prophecy was fulfilled at some point, because his wife is like, okay, enough, stop eating the kids, and she hid one of them, and that was the one that overthrew him, of course. But the reason I bring this up is that these are basically the black paintings of Goya, and this was kind of a dark period in his life. And there are two things that are relevant, I think, here. One is that in ancient Rome, Saturn was the god of a lot of things, but one of them was lead. And when Goya painted these paintings, he in fact was suffering from lead poisoning because of the pigments in the paint. He had ingested some of it. So he was having all this crazy emotional stuff going on, which we now know was due to acute lead intoxication. So I would say that, you know, we don't want to be devouring our young, but some of these environmental toxicants are quietly doing that. And we'll talk more. So overall, like the concepts, first of all, I mean, I'm talking to an environmental health audience, so I don't have to necessarily, but the environmental burden of disease globally is actually quite high in certain areas and not insignificant in the United States. So there's a thought that probably, this has been updated, but probably around 12% of morbidity in the United States is due to an environmental cause. So that would be, you know, you add up air pollution, poor water quality, you know, various toxins, toxicants, et cetera. And we're pretty lucky compared to other areas, but I think we probably could do better. And so what is pediatric environmental health? So the definition, like the book definition, is that, you know, it focuses on the prevention and control of environmental exposures and associated adverse effects on infants, children, adolescents, and young adults. So that's like the book definition. And the Academy of Pediatrics started dealing with children's environmental health back in the 1950s, if you can believe this. And initially it was because of radioactive fallout, but there's other, you know, by the late 50s, early 60s, people were starting to think, well, what are all these other chemicals doing? If this radiation is falling from the air, what other stuff is falling from the air? I see it, I don't know why I keep doing this. I see it as this interaction between the biological environment in your body, this physical environment, and then this social context that all this is taking place. And I see it as kin to occupational health in adults. So I'm trained in pediatrics and occupational medicine. So I see it through like that kind of slightly different lens. And let me see if I can just do one slide at a time. Okay. And this is not unlike the traditional epidemiological triad, right? Where you have, of course, like you're like, excuse me, there are 4 things in the triad. So there's not a triad. Did I do something wrong?
No, you did not do anything wrong. I just want to ask the people on Zoom if they could mute because we're hearing back in the room. So thank you. And I apologize.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Okay. Yeah, this happens all the time on conference calls I'm on, you know, people will be on and then all of a sudden you hear like the dog barking, the child screaming, the car starting up, and 300 yards, turn left. Yeah. So basically, you know, this similar concept between like the agent, like whatever it is that's causing the problem, like could be like air pollution or lead, other environmental like exposures, and the host, and it may go through some kind of vector, you know. And so although this is adapted from infectious disease epidemiology, it can be applied to environmental epidemiology. So a child's occupation, like, is that what we're talking about maybe? So what is a child's occupation? Well, they're supposed to grow and develop and explore things and solve problems and learn new things, and then they become adults, which hopefully they've taken all this stuff with them and they're happy and healthy and they live a long, healthy life. So that's what I see part of my role, and I think that's what pediatrics' role generally is, you know, that we hope that we're able to like take care of the children well enough that when they grow up, they'll have a long, healthy life. Right, happy, healthy. So, but children are different than adults, right? There's different sizes. There's different breathing zones. Like this guy on the bottom has a different breathing zone than me. Oxygen, food, water consumption are different per body weight. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's hand-to-mouth behaviors, of course. And then there's the effective time. Like we know that certain exposures to things, certain disease processes, there's a latency period. And you know, if you get exposed to something that takes 40 years to occur and you're 55 years old, that may not occur during your lifetime. You'll die from something else. But if you're an infant and it takes 40 years to develop that disease, it very well could happen like within a reasonable lifetime, right? I hate to ask, this is not like, what am I thinking, but does anybody know where this picture was taken? Have any idea at all? There's an environmental twist to it, so that's why. So, what? No, it was taken in England on one of the, they have these piers in Brighton that go out into the English Channel. And this was built during the Victorian time, and people would come down for the ocean cure. So basically, they were coming down to the ocean to get away from the high levels of particulate matter in the cities. And because they were noticing all these respiratory illnesses, and at that time they thought it was the miasma, but now we know it was like the particulate matter. These people on the bottom have grown up, like both of us were already grown-ups by that point. But this guy is senior in high school, so he's up to here now. But he won't let me take a picture of him now, so like there's no hope. I've done what I can, right? So the and then the sense of windows of vulnerability. So like the one particular, the same exposure can have different effects depending on when it occurs during a child's development. And often children are exposed to multiple exposures at once, and there may be genetic predisposition to certain adverse effects, like you don't have the right allele of the right detoxification enzyme, and so therefore this organophosphate pesticide is going to cause you more problems. So this is, there'll be a quiz at the end, but not about this. This just illustrates at different points in a child's life. So prenatally, postnatally, there are different things going on in the brain. So cells are proliferating, they're moving, they're connecting, they're myelinating. And so if you have something that affects cell proliferation, let's say mercury, for instance, that's going to have maybe more effect on certain neurons at certain points, depending on when the exposure took place. So adults will have a completely different set of symptoms or presentation than like a fetus that gets exposed to mercury. So whereas like lead is more involved in synapse formation, and so we see effects that continue into early childhood. Does that make sense? And this actually makes doing research in pediatric environmental health very difficult, because you need to know like when exactly like this internal dosing was occurring and what other things were going on at the same time. Lungs also develop like in a similar fashion, like just as a little bud, and then starts branching, and the branches start to get more complicated, and it gets more and more complicated until we got billions and billions of these little alveoli, but it just starts out with one little outpouching. So something that might affect like cell growth is going to affect development of the lung one way, and versus something, that same thing being exposed later in life will have a different effect. I think it's one of these things like where the timing is set. I don't know. So so lung function. So we measured. We something called, I don't know how many clinicians in the room, so I'm just going to explain this in my basic understanding. So minute ventilation is how fast you're breathing times how much air you're bringing in and out. And adults, we breathe like, I don't know, 12, 15 times, 16 times a minute. A little baby, like, might be breathing like 30 times a minute. So you're multiplying the respiratory rate by this tidal volume, like so the in and out, in and out, in and out, which might be small, but there's a lot of it. So you're going to get more and more exchanges of air. And let's see. And then you might be closer to the ground when you're little, right? So dust will come back up. Things that are heavier than air may like accumulate down there. And infants tend to be indoors. Like we spend 90% of our time indoors, but infants tend to spend a lot of time in one room of the house and in the back of the car, and then back to that room in the house and back to the car. So if there's something in there, they're going to get exposed to it. Whereas me, I woke up, I was in my bedroom in Cincinnati and I drove down here. Now, you know, maybe there's some toxin in my bedroom, maybe there's something here, but my dose for the whole day is going to be less than someone who stayed in the exact same spot the whole time. And in school-age children, the whole thing with school buses is fascinating. One of our colleagues did a whole thing on school buses and diesel exhaust, and there's a lot more exposure in there than you might think. All right, so children consume like more water and food per kilogram body weight per day than adults do. Well, we would hope so, right? They're growing hopefully upwards. We are only growing like outwards. And they need a lot of macro and micronutrients to make that happen. Infants tend to have a limited diet. Toddlers, it's also limited, but they also eat things off the floor and non-food items. Of older children and adult is a little bit more varied. And the same thing, like, you know, we worry about water, right? Like people worry about stuff in the water. Well, you know, I filled this in Cincinnati. I just filled it again here. So if there's something in the water in Cincinnati or there's something in the water in Kentucky, I'm getting less, I've diluted out those two doses, right? Whereas you have one kid who's getting their formula made from the same old tap water from, you know, a house with lead pipes or whatever, they're going to get more lead in them than, let's say, an adult who is only there in the morning and then goes somewhere else. All right, I think this, okay, there we go. So yeah, and the hand-to-mouth behaviors are normal. Older children are more independent and they get into a lot more stuff. And the adolescents are usually better, but they lack abstract reasoning. And so they often will, you know, and what's the main hand-to-mouth behavior now with adolescents? It's a jewel, like, right? So the, that is, you know, probably like, in part because of the lack of abstract reasoning. They're like, you know, like, oh, this is fine, this is fun, this is safe, this is wonderful. But like, they don't really think like, okay, well, this could be really bad because they're indestructible, right? So, all right. And then this was done with lead, because lead is fairly easy to study because it's not supposed to be in us. But the main take-home point is that given the same amount of lead, an adult will only absorb like 15% of it, but a child under 2 will absorb over 50% of the same amount. So the internal dose is potentially much higher, and you're talking about a smaller person. So, you know, weight-wise, you know, the average, you know, you got little kids who are, you know, 1-year-old, like, I don't know, like in the maybe 20-pound range, right? You know, adult, maybe 160-pound range, you know, this is completely different. And once again, this latency time. So, you know, decades may, this was first identified in the Hiroshima Nagasaki cohort, where they found that there was increased incidence of breast cancer, but it was based at the age of exposure. So the younger exposed girl, the prepubescent girls, were more likely to develop breast cancer later than the older ones. So they, it's not only the length of time, but there was this developmental hormonal period of vulnerability. So this I put in as a break, and it didn't go beyond that, so that's good. So are there any questions or so far, or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
On your slide, you mentioned it said arsenic on play equipment. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Oh, all right. So yeah, I didn't dwell on that too much. The question is about arsenic on play equipment. There was a point in time where a lot of the play equipment that was wooden was preserved with a chromium, a copper arsenate as basically as a pesticide. So it prevented rot and from insects from eating into it. That, for the most part, was that was phased out like formally. However, those that CCA is still allowed to be used in certain industrial uses. And one of the problems is that when people go to buy stuff at like a big like home center or something, they may not be paying attention to like, oh, this industrial stuff's really cheap, yeah, you know, but it's meant to be used not around children or place where people can be exposed to it. Does that answer the question? Sure. Hopefully we'll go one slide. Okay. So I was going to just talk about two important toxicants. I mean, for that, there's 80,000, right? But like, we'll talk about two because they're widespread and there's some evidence to show that there's a negative impact on children's health. And I'm focusing really on like neurodevelopment because that's where a lot of my work has been. Although I've done some work on asthma and some other areas, but I wanted to talk about these because they're kind of good examples, that's all. Like this isn't meant to be a complete course on any of this. It's really just to get stimulate thinking. So lead and traffic related air pollution. So lead, like very briefly, has been around like forever. The folks at CDC call it the first pollutant. You know, we dug it out of the ground 6,000 years ago, probably longer. This says 6,500 BCE. We think in Turkey, there was some other places in like Mesopotamia that were like 3,000 or 4,000 BCE. So it's like, it's been a long, long time. And toxicity, like most things, like most stuff that gets introduced, like, oh, wow, this is cool. We should use this, blah, blah, blah. So by the ancient Greeks, they're like, oh, whoa, this stuff is dangerous, you know? And, you know, just like we're discovering with a lot of other things, like, oh, wow, this is dangerous. So just to put a historical perspective, because a lot of people say, oh gosh, you know, lead levels have come down so much, like, is this even a thing? I mean, parents would come into our clinic with the lead poisoned kids, they're like, I didn't think this was a thing anymore. I'm like, it's still a thing. I still have a clinic, right? So if you look, this is just a representation of ancient peoples, and each dot represents 40 micrograms of lead in your body. This is typical American, like late 20th century. So we hope it's like gotten a little bit lower over the last like 20 years because it's now like 20 years since the end of the, yeah. And then overt lead poisoning. And I just want to point out that ancient people, that was the amount of lead they were exposed to. 1 dot. So it was humans bringing it out in industrialization that really has made a big difference in terms of spreading this all over the place. A very brief history of lead paint. Basically, late 1800s, we discovered that like lead poisoning was a thing. I mean, they kind of knew it was a thing, but like, and then they realized that it was paint was really the problem, 1904. And then various things happened, and in 1978, we finally banned it. Now, around this, like in the 20s, that's when the Europeans really pushed to start phasing out leaded paint. And it's kind of interesting because right after the European countries agreed to start phasing out lead paint, we started marketing lead paint to children in the form of a paint book. Now, like, you're like, what? Like, would you like Photoshop this together? This is for real. Like, this actually happened. And this is really the first example of marketing something to children to get the adults to buy it. And all you have to do is think of all the other things that are marketed to children now that they really just want parents to buy. Because they know that the biggest salespeople in the entire world is a nagging child. Oh, can I have it? Can I have it? Can I have it? Why can't I have it? Everyone else has it. I need it. I'm going to die if I don't have it. So it turns out with this, you will die if you have it. But I'll just say, so they had this rhyming thing. So the first one at the party was gay electric light. He said, I'm very brilliant. I always shine at night. Though little of my brilliance is due to my glass head, which gives a light much brighter because it's made with, you guessed it, lead. So what they've done is they've tried to normalize lead, even though the ancient Greeks knew that lead was poisonous. The Romans had laws about where you could melt down lead within, not within the city limits. They had, PPE was developed in the Middle Ages to protect metallurgists from lead. We are telling people that they should be painting their house for it because it's perfectly fine. And that's how we have this lead problem, and that's why it's still a thing, in my personal opinion. So what happens when children are exposed to lead, since there's a whole bunch of them? You figure there's 4 million houses in the United States right now that have lead-based paint hazards, and a child under 6 lives in them. And approximately 500,000 children in the US with lead levels that are above the level that the CDC would like them to be under. So one of the problems is that, you know, as I say to parents, the main reason we worry about lead is that lead is a poison. And it's mostly a poison to your brain, particularly the developing brain. And one of the things that it affects is IQ, so cognition. And as you can see, there's a very interesting nonlinear relationship here at low levels, which is complex to explain. But one potential explanation is that picomolar levels of lead will interact with calcium receptors on G protein mediated channels in neurons that normally would respond to millimolar levels of calcium. So picomolar levels of lead trigger the same response as millimolar levels of calcium. So it doesn't take very much lead to trigger whatever this thing is. Now, we don't know how that receptor then ends up with IQ. I don't know like how to connect those together, but you're like, that sounds like something someone should look into. And you see a parallel in school performance. Like as the lead level goes up, this is your probability of basically failing the standardized tests in Michigan. These are given at 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade. And so you can see the thing that's affected the most, first is science is affected the most, ironically. But you know, basically, if the base failing rate for the test, if you had a lead level of 0 when you were a child or undetectable, was like 15%. All right, that's not too bad. By the time you get to 5, which is currently the CDC cutoff, you're looking at like 30% of the kids failing the math test. So that's not great. But the other thing I would say is that it's not like lead is like a black and white thing. Lead is a risk factor, which then gets multiplied by all these other risk factors that are in your life, all these adverse childhood experiences, et cetera. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So behavioral problems are also associated with lead exposure, particularly things related to ADHD. And people look at this and like 25% of the ADHD may be attributable to lead exposure, over 1.3 micrograms per deciliter. Well, that's way below what the CDC is saying. That was the geometric mean at the time that they were of the whole population when they were calculating this. So it's not saying that all the ADHD is due to lead, but there's a chunk that's potentially due to it. And there are other problems too, particularly adult criminal behavior. And, you know, I know when people talk about this, they're like, oh, come on, give me a break. Like lead is causing all this crime. So I'm not saying that lead is causing all the crime. And I have a slide and I'll show you like how much of the crime we think it might be attributable to it. But there are real costs to lead exposure in the United States, about $50 billion a year. Most of that is in lost productivity and incarceration. Mahoning County, Ohio, which is where Youngstown is, if I have my geography right, estimated that for all the kids with a lead level over 10, it was costing them $500,000 a year. Mostly in special education costs. And the return on investment for preventing this in the first place, so this is like public health, right? And policy, preventing lead poisoning, every dollar spent will save to society $17 at least. And this is comparable to vaccines, which have a similar payback. I would argue that one of the issues is that the vaccine loop is a closed loop. You know, these are vaccines are given out in a medical system. You'd be cared for in the medical system if you got sick. So you can see like, oh, we're saving money on the back end by putting it on the front end. But this dollar spent on lead poisoning, that might be on housing. That might be changing formulation of gasoline. That might be re-engineering aircraft engines. That's a lot of money. But they don't see, that doesn't come back to the aircraft manufacturer. That doesn't come back to the people fixing it up. It comes back to the individuals. It comes back to the entire society in that we have people who there's a little less ADHD. People are able to achieve just a little bit more, and it's hard to quantitate that. And I think that's one of the at the end of the origin of species, Darwin says something like basically like one of the hardest things that people are going to, I'm paraphrasing this obviously, one of the hardest things for people to grasp about this whole theory is that the sum total of the effect of a whole bunch of very small changes multiplied over millions and millions of years are almost beyond the realm of the human mind to understand. Because these tiny little movements, they're just like, it's so tiny, but it's like, it's like the last grain of sand that causes the whole sand dune to collapse, because there's trillions of them in there. And it just took one more and it just pushed the whole thing down. And so that's how I kind of think about this. And we just need to nudge the thing in the other direction. So risk factors for incarceration, there's a whole bunch of them. So this is a broken home. They define, and I figured there would be questions like, how do you define all these things? Well, a broken home is basically like one of the parents left, or, large families, so more than 5 people, low socioeconomic status. Like each one of these things, these contribute 10%, relative contribution, 10%, 10%. This is like 12%, urban housing, 15%, maltreatment, 21%, child rearing, 25%, lead, 10%. So I'm not saying it's all due to lead, but like we can actually, we know what causes this, unlike some of the other things that are very complicated to fix. Like, okay, we're going to fix broken homes. We're going to keep everybody, like all the moms and dads or whatever, everyone's going to stay together. We're going to have a perfect house. There's a million reasons why people split up. You can't find like one cure to that, but there is like one cure to the lead. Like we just get rid of it. So there's tons of uses for lead. And you might be thinking, like, do we still use all these things? Well, we still use these in a lot of things. And so, plumbing, well, that's become famous, right? I mean, like the word plumbing, right? Plumbus is the Roman word for lead. It's Latin for lead. So the plumbers were putting in plumbus to make the plumbing, right? And we've stopped doing that, but it's all the old stuff is still there. Paint, obviously, electronics, all kinds of things, as stabilizers for plastics. It's all over the place. So what do I end up doing? What does this pediatric environmental health specialty unit end up doing? I'll tell you in a minute. The reason I brought this up here was that I wanted to just explain, like, there is a potential biological basis for what lead does. And this is a very complicated, it's a diagram to explain, but basically, if you were to create, like in Young Frankenstein, right, they were looking for the normal brain. So what brain did you bring me? Promise you won't be mad. Yeah. So abnormal. Oh, abnormal. So what they had to do was, these colleagues of mine had to create like what was like kind of the normal brain by taking a whole bunch of brain scans and figuring out what the volume is in different anatomical areas of the brain. And then what they did was they looked at adults who had been exposed to lead in the Cincinnati lead study. So they were exposed to lead as children. They've been followed for almost 40 years. And so they put them through the scanner over at Cincinnati Children's and says, okay, if ADHD is the problem and problems with language are the problem, is lead affecting these areas anatomically? And what they found was that areas of the prefrontal cortex and the cerebellum, the frontal cortex appear to be smaller in people who are exposed to more lead. So, well, that's not very good. So there's more studies obviously going on, but I just illustrate that it isn't just, there's a biology under this too. It isn't just like these observations that we're making. So what does the pediatric environmental health specialty unit do? So I see children who come in with elevated lead levels, right? 2 children came in. Turned out, we asked all this history. Dad worked in an e-waste recycler. And he was grinding up television sets, basically. The big old like picture tube. I throw it in and the dust comes out all over the place. This is like exactly what he says. He wears his clothes home and his wife says he comes home covered with dust. And he greets the kids at the door and they play with him. They're like 1 and 2. And each picture tube has like 1 to 2 kilograms of lead in it. We're measuring micrograms in the children, right? So this is a lot. Well, what happened was I saw them, the health department got involved, they inspected the house, found no lead in the construction of the building. but there was lead at the front door, dust at the front door. So they're like, this must be coming in from somewhere. So what happened was CDC and OSHA got involved and they investigated the work site. And what we found was that this is the actual machine that they were throwing them in. It's called CRT Heaven. They called it the Angel Devil machine because they were sending them to either heaven or hell, I guess. I don't know. And yeah, this found its way into the Huffington Post. But anyway, the issue was that they were grinding this up, and as you can see, like there's inadequate protections in place. So this is an occupational problem that has led to a pediatric problem. And what they found was there was high levels of lead all around. Employees continue to have lead on them despite hand washing, and the uniforms that they were wearing, like almost all of them had lead on them. And it illustrates how people from completely different ends of the spectrum can all work together for children's health, right? So this was a paper that we wrote to describe all this. And you know, a lot of times, like, when I talk to my like PhD colleagues and like the serious researchers, I would call them, they're like, a case report, really? Like, so it turns out like this is very useful for policy, because what happened was this article was chosen of one of 5 articles to be chosen into Chinese, to be translated into Chinese, to be distributed by the Chinese version of the CDC, because they felt e-waste recycling is a huge problem in China. 2, they used this as the basis to change the worldwide credentialing of these e-waste recycling facilities, because they cited 2 children in Cincinnati, Ohio, who had become lead poisoned because of a facility that did not have proper controls. So this seems like a very small thing. It's just like a little like pebble that you throw into the water. And you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I was like, we got to do something about this. And then, oh, we ought to write it up. The next thing you know, like, oh gosh, this is actually more important than we thought. And I'm not putting this up here to like toot my horn. I'm putting this up there for all these people who see something that looks unusual, like tell other people about it. Like sometimes, I mean, you get on like YouTube or I mean, there's so much stuff on there that no one needs to know about. And there's all these other things that we're doing that people really need to know about. I'm sorry, I get really like verklempt. So, and then the another little project we're working on now is like, how do we like make a difference? Like, so we're trying to identify communities where their kids are being exposed to this. And what we're finding is it's communities that people weren't necessarily thinking about. So this is what our community engagement core is now like starting to work on, is how do we help these communities that we know that these kids are being exposed to stuff, where's it coming from, and how can we help them deal with it? So this is another pause. This is a painting no one will know about. My wife saw this when she was teaching a class over at the Cincinnati Art Museum. She's a family doctor. She was teaching an art and medicine class. And she walked in, and this is at the end of one of the hallways. And it's kind of this smog like hanging over Mount Adams. And she's like, oh my gosh, this is why we're in Cincinnati. We came here, talking to me, for you to study air pollution. I'm like, yes, this is why we're here. So this is a painting of Cincinnati in the late 19th century with the smog and fog coming in. So what is traffic-related air pollution? Well, it's a complex mixture, more complex than I put up here. But basically, there are particles, and I hope there's not air pollution researchers in here because they're all gonna like stone me or something, but there's vapors and there's gases. And these things combine together in different ways because the chemistry is very dynamic. So you may be starting with something that's a gas, and then it starts aggregating together, and then you get bigger particles. But some of these particles are very small, like they're only like 20 nanometers across. But they're much bigger than the little, like, you know, the gases and vapors. And depending on what gases and vapors are there, you get different outputs. And, you know, this is why on a hot day, humid day, we get different, you know, oh, there's an ozone alert because the VOCs are mixing with the NOxs and they're making ozone. So diesel exhaust is something that we have a particular problem with in Cincinnati because the amount of truck traffic that goes through. And so there's been a lot of interest in studying that. And also, in terms of a particle, it has very nice temporal and spatial variability. So you can find highly exposed areas and low exposed areas within a fairly small area, whereas larger particles tend to settle out like over an entire metropolitan area at around the same density. Not perfectly, but so what our measure that we use is what we call elemental carbon attributed to traffic. So this is basically elemental carbon, which is what comes out of the exhaust. And then all this other stuff that accumulates on here are pieces of the engine, like microscopic, pieces of the engine, other stuff that's in the fuel, things that are in the air, they combine together. And it also like pulls on to like other toxic things like glue and carries them around. These are about 20 nanometers across, so very, very tiny. And they can translocate to all different parts of the body, the brain being the one that we were most interested in. And what we think is they cause some oxidative stress, like everything does, right? Like all these chemicals, oxidative stress is one of the common pathways. So I just pulled this up just so you would kind of orient you. So this was a little project we did when I was a fellow. And what we did was we wanted to look at traffic-related air pollution and behavior scores when the kids got older. So we looked at early life exposure, and we thought about lead, because early life exposure to lead is what leads to these problems later in life. So is this a particularly vulnerable time for air pollution exposure in children or not? We didn't know. And so, well, actually we now know, but at the time we didn't know, right? So, and what we picked as the behavioral scores were related to ADHD, because we thought, well, if it's coming in, since the ultrafine particles have been found in the prefrontal cortex, and we know like executive function is affected by that, and we know stuff with lead affects executive function that way with oxidative stress. Well, maybe there's something going on there. So, and ADHD is pretty common, and we'd find it in a population of children, right? So, so that's how we picked it. So, our study, if you look here, this is like a kind of a chunk of the map. These red dots are some of the locations where we put the air sensors, and the blue dots are where the kids live. And this was from a birth cohort for people who either lived close to the highway or far away. So less than 400 meters or more than 1,500 meters. The cohort was actually looking at allergy and asthma. And so they all had to have a parent who had to have a positive skin prick test. So someone had to have like allergies, but that wasn't like, we weren't necessarily interested in that, but it may potentially reduce our generalizability of the study. So that's why I report it. And by the time they were 7 years old, we had about 600 kids who had still stayed in the study. The one nice thing about Cincinnati is that it has an incredibly strong gravitational pull. And so people live there and they often don't leave. Like there's very few places that you can have a birth cohort that's still going on for 40 years. And so it allows for longitudinal studies that are very hard to do almost anywhere else. So what we used was the BASC-2. There's now a BASC-3, but at the time a BASC-2 was the state of the art. And what we measured, it's used in psychology basically to diagnose people with problems, but it also can be used in a research setting to see like what are the symptom scores, subscale symptom scores. And basically it's standardized, so like any score has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, and anything that's over 60 would be considered at risk. And just as a group, it was a little bit, there were 55% boys. Maternal education is important because that comes back later as an important variable, but 21% of people had less than a high school education. The average ECAD exposure, the trap exposure, was about the same for other studies of other urban areas. So it was similar to Boston, it was similar to California. And then we looked at other things that we knew that might be associated with ADHD. So we know cigarette exposure is home built prior to 1950, so that's a lead marker. And then, you know, the kids, the percentage, about 20% of kids had scores that were considered high risk. So when we looked, I've summarized this quite a lot, obviously. So when you look at it initially, you're like, oh, okay, well, actually, so if we dichotomize the TRAP level at the highest tertile, which was also the mean, we found that there was a significant association between only hyperactivity and the exposure to TRAP. And this was held up after being adjusted for basically the 3 other variables that held up in the model. So like, oh, okay, so there's something, you know, there's something going on here. But we wanted to really dig into this a little bit further. And what was interesting was that we found that really this was more, it hurt the kids with parents with higher education than not. And we're like, that's really not what anyone was thinking a priori. And so it's interesting because we've seen another study where we looked at asthma readmission and air pollution exposure. And it seemed to affect only the white children and not the African-American children. And we're like, it affects everybody. So like, why is it that? And what the issue was that there were a bunch of other like confounding effects, like particularly within the African-American community, that were stronger contributors to, you know, stronger predictors than what we were measuring. And so we think that's what's happening here too, is that we don't, you know, the lower educated mothers more likely to have ADHD themselves, and that's somehow behind here, confounding it. We've been unable to tease that out. So actually future, like the study's still going on. They've been looking at the parental characteristics, so we can start to adjust for those, because this was an allergy study initially. It was not a neurodevelopment study, and this was our first attempt to try to use it for this, and we found something that was a lot more interesting than we thought we were going to find, as usual, right? So and of course, is it just that parents are just more uptight, you know, they're just reporting more ADHD symptoms. So and then maternal education was also strongly correlated with other things that were potentially benefit. So we already know that TRAP is associated with neuroinflammation and mucosal inflammation. And could there be some interplay between the neurological and immunological systems during this first year of life that makes them vulnerable? I mean, there's more studies. I mean, this is a few years ago this came out. So there's a whole bunch of other studies that have been coming on. And we worry about the dopaminergic pathways because of like these dopamine containing neurons are basically like hand grenades ready to go off. Like dopamine is very unstable inside of cells. And when the cells are put under stress, they're liable to, you know, get damaged and release or you know, improperly release the dopamine. And dopamine is part, we think, of the whole like brain signaling pathway that causes ADHD. Not the only one, but one of them. So the CCAPS is what we call this, the Cincinnati Childhood Allergy and Air Pollution Study. The brain section has been going on. And so looking at parents, looking at exposure after the first year of life, trying to connect this all together. And just, this is dated 2020, so this has just come out, that the same group started looking at the same person who was doing the neuroimaging for lead is now looking at traffic-related air pollution. And we're seeing a different pattern. And this is only a subset of the group. But it's hinting once again that there may be some biological basis here that's neurological that we can start to understand better. And this is before, you know, they've started to dig into gene environment and other exposures. This is like really the first like blow across the bow to try to understand this. So it's some very interesting work. And the reason I want to bring this up is that, you know, we know a lot about lead. We've known about it forever. And this is something new that may be just as bad, but in a completely different way. And what I didn't show on here is they have another set of images which show the effect on the cerebellum, which is actually quite profound, but doesn't show up well on the pictures, like when you project it. And so this is similar to lead as well. So the the cerebellum does a lot more stuff with like connecting. Basically, the cerebellum is what keeps me like standing up and moving my arms and not like falling over and confusing myself, basically. And so it's coordinating a lot of the body sensory systems and the motor movements simultaneously. And so potentially like interesting work in the future. But like this is, I just wanted to put this up as it just came out like the beginning of last week. So this is the very last little part. So do we have any time left? We have time. Oh, okay. Yeah, we should be good. And there'll be time for questions probably. This is Yosemite. So we went here for vacation. I put like vacation shots mostly in here. So what, all right. So what is the PACU other than like an unfortunate acronym, right? So the pediatric environmental health specialty units were created in the late 1990s, basically because of two like crazy like chemical exposures to children that occurred in the 90s. One was a group of children who had moved into what was like new loft apartments in, I think, Jersey City, New Jersey, in a building that had been used for making mercury thermometers. And the mercury levels, like the metallic mercury levels, like were unbelievable. And they developed like all these neurologic symptoms. It was a mess. So there was that. And then there was another, I'm trying to remember, I think it was something, it was, I think a refinery exploded somewhere and all these children were, it was near school. And so they're like, we have nobody to help with this. So basically this was under the Clinton administration, was this executive order to begin like dealing with environmental risks to children. And the funding for the program is provided through ATSDR, which is part of the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of the CDC. And the EPA helps to part fund this. And the purpose of these, and so we're spread out, there's one PACU in every region, except for Region 5, which has two. They have me down in Cincinnati. I'm using the old map because it looks nicer than the new map, because the colors come up better. So Region 5 is all of the Midwest. Region 4 is where Kentucky is. And, but the PACU is based in Atlanta at Emory. And since Kentucky is like right across the river, I'm like, yeah, well, I'll just come over to Kentucky. So the, yeah, there's, we have, obviously like everyone, we have a website and stuff like that. But the, basically part of our job is to translate environmental health into practice. So there isn't really something for adults, although there is occupational environmental medicine, which is a separate specialty for adults. But there aren't like centers like this to call about adult problems, unless you call like a specific maybe university clinic or something like that that does occupational medicine and does some environmental medicine on the side. And environmental health is not really part of the standard medical school curriculum. Like the students at University of Cincinnati at UC, they, I do a couple lectures for the first years where I introduce them to epidemiology, and then they run screaming out of the room. And then, no, they don't. They're like, one of them is mandatory, so everyone's there, and the second one is not, and so you can imagine how empty the room is. And the other, I do an environmental justice activity with them to, actually it's an interactive thing where we have data and they work in these learning communities. So they're actually out in different neighborhoods of the city working with non-governmental organizations doing outreach. And so you have students who have already met with some of their partners out there. And so now we present environmental data and health data about the community that they're working in. And so it helps to like kind of make it real. But that's basically like all the environmental health they get. Unless as a third year, they come through my clinic and spend an afternoon with me and they get another 4 hours. But most medical schools, they estimate at most, they get 4 hours of environmental health. And if you consider that 12% of the morbidity in the United States is due to environmental health, there should be a whole course about it. because the number of people that, I've had lectures about atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome, which has an incidence, they think, because it's so low, it's hard to predict, 1 case per 1 to 2 million children. And Cincinnati Children's has an entire research center dedicated to this, like a laboratory dedicated to this. Because like we get interested in these, like, we call it, in medicine, we call this a fascinoma. Like it's this really interesting thing, but it may not, have this huge, like public health implication, but it's really, really interesting. Like to understand the mechanism of how that worked, it would be cool, right? And you could probably develop a drug for it, but the drug is going to be used maybe like a few times a year. Whereas the stuff here in environmental health, like people are getting asked about this all the time. And what happens is that they go to their regular doctor and they're like, yeah, I don't know, that sounds okay. And then what they do is they go to a complementary alternative medicine doctor who gives them a whole bunch of non-evidence-based advice and takes a huge amount of their money. And my feeling is like we've got to, it's incumbent upon, like I see myself as a physician, it's incumbent upon me to make sure that there are people out there who understand this enough, or at least know who to call for help. So environmental health is really not even required as like routine training. And our group is there to provide consultation, education, and outreach. So like, that's kind of why I'm here, right? And we have a clinic, and I see like a lot of different things, but like, so we have like a clinical home, like where people can come when they have concerns about indoor air quality, or, I've recently had a family that there was a concern at the school that was being renovated and stuff. And so I worked with the local health department, and they had someone go out, and they did actually find some things wrong with the school, and that there are laws about how that has to be fixed. But if they went to their regular doctor's like, I don't know, it's probably fine. Well, actually it wasn't fine. And so, translating, so in summary, I'll start here. Translating research into action is a slow, painstaking process. Trust me, because like that's most of my job. And but it's been fun. I don't know, that's stupid, but like it's enjoyable. And when you see like something actually work out, or someone like avoid something bad, you're like, okay, we actually did something good. So things just to take away: lead exposure in childhood is a risk factor for poor adult functioning. Whether that's, there's a whole, lead affects every organ of the body, and I just talked about one. And so there are a lot of different things that could go on, but it starts in childhood. And if you lose like a couple of IQ points in childhood, you're that much closer to dementia when you get older, because you started at a lower level, right? People who have poor lung function to start, all the preemies who have poor lung function to start because they got delivered at 24 weeks instead of 40 weeks, they have a little less lung function. So when they get into their 40s and 50s, when their lung function starts to go down, they've already started at a lower point, and they're going to get sicker faster. And so, and once again, traffic-related air pollution is becoming recognized as a neurodevelopmental toxicant. Not like lead that we know everything. There's still a ton to learn. There's still all these other chemicals. We were just looking at diesel. Like there's a whole laundry list of other chemicals in there, and which ones are doing what, we don't know yet. And so there's a lot, that's what research is for, right? So there's a lot of people to acknowledge. So this is very brief, and I'll help everybody get 100%, because I have to report the scores. What percent, did you get over 80%? I'm like, okay, we're gonna get 100%, right? So true or false? Childhood lead exposure is a risk factor for adult incarceration.
True.
So true, just raise your hand so I can see. Oh, great, great, yeah, true. Traffic-related air pollution is a risk factor for childhood behavior problems. Okay, great, we got 100% here. So I can report back that we got 100%. I got in trouble because I wasn't reporting enough post-tests on my thing last quarter, so. So here's my contact, they'll have the contact information too, and then I'll just leave you like in a very nice place. This is one of the San Juan Islands in about 2 or 3 hours north of Seattle. The
that pollution or is that fog?
That's fog. That's fog. Yeah, this was. I didn't have my. I have like, and my kids think I'm nuts. Like I have a little air pollution sensor in the kitchen that I take around sometimes, but I didn't bring it there. But yeah, it was all fog. It's just like there were only like 5 of us on this whole island, so it was very quiet. So thank you so much. And if you have questions or yeah, sure.
I think it's Bill Bryce in the short history of just about everything. He has a whole section on the gentleman who's lead, the gas, whole,
Oh, Thomas Midgley.
the whole journey through that, how it was fought, by the auto industry, gas companies.
Correct.
Take the gas out of.
Right. Yeah, that's like the lead out of the gas. In fact, so a little like disclosure here. The people who most vociferously argued to keep lead in gasoline was the founder of the Department of Environmental Health at the University of Cincinnati, Robert Kehoe. And as it says on the library blog, the UC library blog website, which of course everyone reads, right? They said, well, he could be seen as an apologist for big industry. And the truth is, like everyone, we leave behind a very complicated legacy. And his legacy is just as complicated as others. But one of the things that he said, he had that we call the Kehoe paradigm. And that was that he felt that with regards to environmental exposures, that industry would be best to self-regulate than to be constrained by legislative or regulatory control. And I would argue that that's a very long shadow for a person that almost no one has ever heard of. And in my mind, this is my opinion, I think he used his bully pulpit as a physician to bully other researchers and epidemiologists and other physicians who were sounding the alarm that lead in gasoline is bad. I mean, I didn't put the slide up here, but at the time in the early 70s, when they started measuring childhood lead levels in the NHANES, the average childhood lead level was over 16. Removal of lead of gasoline brought that down by 90%. And it's very clear that that Kehoe and Midgley and that whole legacy, really, it's a shame that people like Alice Hamilton weren't listened to, because she was the physician who very strongly argued that lead should never be put in gasoline, because she was saying don't put it in it because they hadn't done it yet. And Aaron has done work to argue that we should not put MMMT, which is a manganese-containing octane-boosting compound, into gasoline, because we also know that incurs neurocognitive problems as well. So, great. I'm glad. I love environmental health history. It's like, well, it's actually like a history of like a whole bunch of awful stuff. But, yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.